welcome everyone to the Queer of Color Analysis and Education Research Institute virtual symposium on reimagining and redefining education in times of COVID and anti-Blackness. I want to begin this evening's event by giving a land acknowledgement. As we gather tonight, we acknowledge the sacred land on which the University of Toronto is situated. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. We are mindful of broken treaties and agreements across this land and the systemic and institutional systems of power that have violently displaced and attempted to erase, Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge that as settlers on this land, we need to become allies, co-conspirators against contemporary colonialism, and we stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in Toronto and across Turtle Island. We also want to acknowledge the video conferencing software we are using, Zoom, has erected its headquarters in San Jose, California, and that this is the territory once stewarded by the Mukwekma Ohlone tribal nation. Current members of this now federally unrecognized tribal nation are direct descendants of the many missionized tribal groups from across the region. The territory now referred to as California was populated by approximately 150,000 Indigenous people in 1846, and by 1873, after a mass campaign enacted by the American military forces, regional militia, and private citizens, settlers, and pioneers, at least 80% of the Indigenous population in this area had been slaughtered. We who are able to connect with each other via Zoom are deeply indebted to the Mukwekma Ohlone people, as the lands and waters they so carefully stewarded now support the people, pipelines, and technologies that carry our breaths, images, and words across vast distances to others. And finally, I want to give thanks to the organizing team here that you won't see their faces, but they have put in so much work behind the scenes to make this this symposium possible. I'm talking about Navaz Makani, Emily Rivas, and Tanitia Monroe. So thank you so much for all of your work and for all of your support in making this symposium happen. Now I'm going to, I just want to introduce Nick Salmon, who's director of the Center for the Study for the United States, one of the sponsors of this event, who's going to give us a bit of information about our sponsor and also about a couple of other events.
Thank you, Lance, and welcome everybody to this very exciting event. I'm Nick Salmon, the director for the Center for the Study of the United States, the home of American Studies here at the University of Toronto. And I'm very pleased to congratulate our Bissell Hayde Fellow, Dr. Lance McCready, on putting together what I think is going to be a really exciting and educational event today. Thank you, Lance, and thank you to the team as well for all of your hard work. We're very grateful. Just a couple of quick announcements about upcoming events at the Center for the Study of the United States. On November 5 at Thursday from 4 to 5:30 p.m., Professor Rebecca Wanzo, Professor and Chair of the Department of Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Washington University, will be talking with Professor Lauren McLeod Kramer about her new book, The Content of Our Caricature. And I highly recommend tuning in for that. It's going to be a really exciting event. Also on November 19, Thursday from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. is our F. Ross Johnson Colloquium this semester, which is Lives on the Edge, a colloquium on precarity. Please tune in. You'll find information on both these events at the CSUS website. Again, thank you, Lance, for this event today, and thank you all panelists for coming. I'm very grateful to be a part of this. Thanks. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot, Nick. Much appreciated. And those are some great events that the Center for Study United States is putting on. So I encourage everyone to continue to conversations and learning through attending these events. I just want to give a bit of an introduction to the symposium, say a bit about the first panel and our speakers, and then we will begin. Queer of color analysis and critique is a mode of analysis grounded in the struggles and world-making of LGBTQ people of color. Activists, artists, and theorists have mobilized queer of color critique to interrogate the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, class, nation, and diaspora as a response to the inherent whiteness of mainstream queer theory and persistent heterosexism in ethnic studies. In this symposium, we put queer of color analysis and critique to work in times of COVID and anti-Blackness in order to unsettle the dominant discourses, key questions, and normative beliefs in formal schools education, non-formal education, which is in community organizations, and informal education through everyday interactions and social media. We aim to reimagine and redefine education through interrupting hegemonic processes of knowledge production and inform transformative pedagogical work that benefits queer students of color specifically and anti-racist, queer, feminist, social justice education scholarship more broadly. The first panel from 5:40 to 6:15 will consider how trauma, stigma, violence, and mourning haunt our everyday lives, including the streets, schools, and transnational networks that are the sites of education. Our first speaker will be Cindy Cruz from Arizona State University. Our second speaker will be Ed Brockenbrough from the University of Pennsylvania. And our third speaker will be Roland Coloma from Wayne State University. Each of our speakers will take 5 to 7 minutes to present about trauma, stigma, violence, and mourning. Thank you. Cindy. Oops, you're muted.
Okay, let me begin. I was thinking about what it means to do a queer of color critique in times of COVID. And so I wrote a little bit, so I'm gonna read a little bit of a paper. I overheard a group of students in a Zoom chat room try to organize their time for a presentation that they will have to give in class. One student asked if they could meet in person with social distancing and masks, and a second student answered her abruptly, "No way, not at this time." "I just want to be with people," said the first student. "No matter how much I try, Zoom does not substitute for the connection that students yearn for." This loss of connection is isolation. It is a mourning. This is the place from which we are working, teaching, maintaining relationships, and trying to connect with friends, colleagues, family, and lovers. I often think that when scholars use the term queer of color, work by lesbians of color often gets subsumed under this umbrella of queer. Maybe we forget why we added the qualifier of color to our scholarship. Queer youth of color, teachers of color, people of color. Somehow this connection with lesbian of color thought gets lost too. Or I read all too often the loss of queer when we write about Gloria Anzaldúa and do not grapple with the notion that she was a lesbian and how her dykeness is foundational in her understanding of her worlds. In this time of COVID-19, perhaps our attention to queer of color critique needs to be pedagogical. The anthology This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, has been foundational in my analysis of queer youth experiences and resistance. I'm revisiting Bridge at this time to think about the practices of lesbians of color. I'm revisiting the Combahee River Collective's insistence that the major systems of oppression are interlocking and that the synthesis of these oppressions create the conditions of our lives. to help me understand COVID and its fallout. I'm engaging with Max Valerio's observation that they feel almost crippled by homesickness and the isolation that comes from a pandemic. I am thinking about and with the queer street youth I work with in Los Angeles, where home is often not safe for them. To see Bridge in its political context is to read it as a documentation of isolation, from the racism of the women's movement, from social movements that do not take issues of gender and sexuality seriously, from Black women's continuous life and death struggle for survival and liberation that comes from Combahee. But Bridge is also a primer to help me understand the reality of our politics through a women of color practice of writing, one that is intersectional in its analysis, is urgent in its communicating the high stakes for the authors, and is resisting, always resisting in its storytelling, even in the smallest of gestures. And I am thinking about Anzaldua's vision of a coalition of third world women and progressive men of color and queers and trans folk, all in this time of a huge election in the United States and the work necessary to achieve this. Perhaps queer of color critique can make a move to reimagine what we need to build coalition. You know, I don't want to let go of this vision of Bridge. What this has forced me to do is to ask of myself and my students to do another kind of writing and engagement, a reflexive writing that asks some very frightening questions. And I quote Shri Moraga, how have I internalized my own oppression? How have I oppressed? You know, some people read the Bible to help them understand their worlds. I read Bridge. Maria Lugones, una marimacha cachapera jota theorist, not queer, words that she chose instead of queer, gives us the notion of a faithful witnessing, where we learn with others the difficult practice of recognizing resistance in tight spaces. It is very hard work to reconsider or revise or reconfigure our experience, either in our writing or in our own understanding of ourselves and others around us. It is a move against the grain of power and a refusal to act in loyalty with oppression. Faithful witnessing is Lugones's call for women of color, and I would dare add queers of color, to move away from a monosensical life, to find different ways of accessing meanings that can be constructed against the grain of oppression, to world travel in ways that are not agonistic or hierarchical, racist or transphobic, to sense resistance, as she would say, to interpret behavior as resistant even when it is dangerous. I mourn the passing of Maria Lugones from July 2020. And, you know, at this time, I believe it is our turn to faithfully witness the violence and trauma of COVID-19. And maybe it's our responsibility to reread these student practices that we see on Zoom. To wear a mask is to choose to live. And you know what, when they don't, maybe we can't assume that they're choosing something other than life. Maybe they're choosing resistance or this play and blame for students for going to a party, for being in a sorority, so for all these gatherings that students yearn for. Because, or maybe we need to look at some of these practices when you leave home is to remove yourself from a toxic space. And to yearn for connection is to say what you need from your classmates at this time. Sometimes they answer difficult questions in the Zoom chat, affirm each other's posts. They stick around after Zoom to chat with me, a gentle banter that is almost like the face-to-face conversations I have with students after every class. Or maybe I should say I had with students after every class. I am asking them to recognize these practices of women of color writing and to write about their own experiences, to tell me and others in the class about your stories of resistance, to reconnect with your classmates who also yearn for connection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy.
Can folks see my screen, the image on my screen?
Yep.
Thanks. Okay. On May 30th of this year, thousands of protesters took to the streets of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the city I call home, to protest the brutal murder of George Floyd. Among those protesters were two of my Black queer friends who were live streaming on Facebook as they marched in the streets. Stuck at home because of pre-existing health conditions, I used Facebook to alert my Black queer friends on the ground of police movements that were visible from TV news channels' helicopter feeds. And when my friends' live streams were interrupted by the police's violent use of tear gas and rubber bullets on protesters, I used other digital platforms to track down my Black queer friends and offer bail money if needed. On September 25th of this year, a Black queer friend used Facebook to live stream a modest memorial service for Shay Clark, a high-profile and deeply loved Black Philadelphian trans woman who had passed away on September 8th. Since COVID prevented the type of large community gathering that normally would have marked the passing of such a beloved Black queer community member, my friend used his Facebook feed to broadcast the smiles, stories, and tears of a small assembly of Black queer mourners in front of the now closed Black queer bar where Miss Shay used to bartend. It was in that bar where I met Miss Shay, where she used to serve strong mixed drinks and lip sync to Patti LaBelle, and where, after overhearing me one night confess that I didn't know how to fry chicken, Miss Shay graciously shared with me her fried chicken recipe. On October 23rd of this year, the Black Gay Stuck at Home series screened Pay It No Mind, The Life and Times of Marsha P. Johnson. Created by Michael Ward and Joshua Henry Jenkins, Black Gay Stuck at Home, quote, is our effort to both gather folks together, but to also center Black queer film, allowing for folks to engage with one another and build community, but to also engage with familiar and perhaps new work centering Black queer experiences, unquote. Starting with a Zoom screening and discussion on April 10th of this year of Patrick Ian Polk's film, Punks, Black Gay Stuck at Home has countered Black queer isolation during COVID with Black queer virtual questioning and communion. I shared these accounts as a way to revisit Black queer digital publics, a phenomenon I've been trying to understand for the past few years. I draw here upon Mark Lamont Hill's work on Black Twitter, the network of Black Twitter users that has developed a culture of collective responses over the past several years to anti-Black violence in the US. Hill states, quote, by digital counterpublic, I refer to any virtual, online, or otherwise digitally networked community in which members actively resist hegemonic power, contest majoritarian narratives, engage in critical dialogues, or negotiate oppositional identities, unquote. Building on Hill's piece, I think about Black queer digital counterpublics as another instance of what he called a, quote, digitally networked community in which members actively resist hegemonic power, contest majoritarian narratives, engage in critical dialogues, and again, negotiate oppositional identities, unquote. Our current historical moment provides a unique vantage point on the affordances and challenges of Black queer digital counterpublics as the confluence of the COVID pandemic and state-sanctioned anti-Black violence has intensified our reliance on digitally networked communities. The three examples I shared earlier suggest how Black queer digital counterpublics complement modes of in-person Black queer community building and knowledge production. And it's important to stress that these digital engagements are more than just instances of Black queer people using digital technologies. Violence, mourning, and isolation are familiar tropes, familiar foes in Black queer narratives. Black queer digital counterpublics offer contemporary and relevant modes of resistance against them. The possibilities and precarities of this historical moment also lead to many questions about Black queer digital counterpublics. As a Black queer educational studies scholar, I want to highlight three. First, how do we maintain the advantages of semi-private Black queer knowledge production in public digital spheres? From how to cruise for a date to how to avoid police harassment, examples abound of private exchanges of knowledge among Black queers, knowledge that historically has been critical for our survival in anti-Black queer worlds. That knowledge may lose some of its effectiveness if accessed by outsiders in public digital spaces. Second, how might we imagine the relationship between Black queer digital counterpublics and formal educational institutions? While the COVID-inspired prevalence of online learning creates new opportunities for schooling to draw virtually upon more diverse bodies of knowledge, the integration of Black queer digital counterpublics into formal educational institutions, if desired, will require strategy and likely subterfuge. And lastly, how do we contend with the prominence of spectacles of anti-Black queer violence in the digital sphere, while sounding the alarm against these forms of violence, particularly against Black trans women? These spectacles also have the power to reinscribe trauma and victimhood in Black queer viewers. These are just three of the pedagogical dilemmas that emerge from my thinking about Black queer digital counterpublics, and I look forward to discussing them further. Thanks.
Just want to check if my slide is up.
Yep.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Anti-Asian racism has been on the rise in the United States and Canada since the COVID-19 global outbreak in January 2020. Asians and those mistaken for Asians have been blamed for the virus's contagious infections and tragic casualties, and consequently have become targets of racist and xenophobic profiling and violence. They have become victims of physical attacks, verbal assaults, and racist microaggressions. Ongoing violence and intimidation have created a pervasive environment of fear and anxiety, leading many Asian Americans and Asian Canadians to shun public spaces and interactions for physical and psychological safety. According to reported cases, there have been over 2,500 incidents of anti-Asian racism in the US and over 600 incidents in Canada during the pandemic. And in most cases, no one came to help or defend the assaulted individuals. For LGBTQs of Asian descent during the pandemic, they experienced a double whammy. According to Glenn Magpantay, Executive Director of the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance, the rise in anti-Asian violence have left the LGBTQAPI community disproportionately vulnerable. Many queer Asians avoid leaving their house in fear of being attacked. Michael Nguyen, the chair of Gay Asian Pacific Alliance, asks, "Am I going to be gawked at? Will I be the victim of a hate crime?" The racialization of the pandemic occurs both in person and online, even in gay hookup apps. Michael Rivera sent a simple, "Hi, how are you?" message to a guy on Grindr. The guy's immediate reply and rejection was, "Bye, coronavirus." Queer of color critique functions as a powerful interpretive tool to examine the double whammy of pandemic violence experienced by LGBTQ Asian Americans and Asian Canadians. Queer analysis asks questions about LGBTQ individuals' perspectives, and conditions during the pandemic, while critical race ethnic analysis focuses on the pandemic's impact on Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color. Working at the intersection of race and sexuality, queer of color critique needs to attend to transnational dimensions of power, oppression, and subjectivities in order to avoid methodological nationalism that situates the nation state as the sole unit of analysis. I suggest that taking a transnational approach to queer of color critique facilitates a fuller understanding of the experiences of diasporic, racialized queer subjects, such as LGBTQ Asian Americans and Asian Canadians. The pandemic has certainly raised the specter of disease-contagious subjects, with Asians and queers marked and stigmatized as carriers of illness, infection, and death. Historically, the exclusion of Chinese migrants to the US and Canada in the late 1800s and early 1900s was justified by yellow peril characterizations of Asians as bearers of smallpox, leprosy, syphilis, and the bubonic plague. And Chinatowns were deemed as unsanitary and dangerous sites, harboring public health, social, and moral decay. More recently, the SARS virus outbreak in the early 2000s was associated with people of Asian descent, furthering the racialization of epidemics and infectious diseases. At the same time, queers are continuously vilified as vessels of disorder, disease, and death, especially with the depictions of homosexuality as an illness and of HIV and AIDS as a gay affliction. Some religious leaders view the coronavirus as divine punishment for homosexuality, echoing a problematic refrain connecting queerness to immorality and contagion to retribution. Mobilizing a transnational approach to queer of color critique disrupts geospatial demarcations of here versus over there or somewhere else, especially when epidemics, white supremacy, xenophobia, and gender and sexual prejudice do not concede to national borders as barriers for their violent inflictions. It certainly does not help when the current occupant of the White House and others in his administration routinely refer to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus, Wuhan virus, and even Kung flu. Scapegoating language can stoke fear, bias, and blame. Consider the terms Spanish flu, Middle East respiratory syndrome, and West Nile virus. Also consider when HIV and AIDS used to be referred to as GRID, or gay-related immune deficiency. As a result, the World Health Organization issued guidance in 2015 for naming infectious diseases, recommending that they do not include geographic, cultural, or population references. Words matter, and labels can stigmatize people within and across borders. Kelsey Liu, the CEO of GMHC, formerly Gay Men's Health Crisis, confesses that during this pandemic, quote, "I have felt more Asian than I've ever before," and unquote. The heightened visibility of Asian Americans and Asian Canadians has resulted to increased racist violence and microaggressions. It has also led queer Asian American and Asian Canadian community groups to form advocacy, skill building, and support systems. For example, in California, API Equality started a Dragon Fruit Project phone tree to check in with community members who may need food and other essential supplies. In British Columbia, Pride in Chinatown 2020 took place from August 8 to September 7 as not only a bold gesture claiming Chinatown as a safe space for LGBTQ+ people and allies, but as a rebuttal against the recent acts of racist aggression and discrimination amplified by COVID-19. So while pandemic violence at the intersection of race and sexuality is on the rise, queer Asian Americans and Asian Canadians are also rising to advocate for equity and justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. Wow. Those were three invitations to so much more thinking about how queer of color critique and analysis can help us deal with and think through trauma, stigma, violence, and mourning resulting from anti-Blackness and COVID. I really appreciate how each of you gave us a different way of thinking about and putting queer of color analysis and critique to work. I really appreciate how Cindy sort of really brought us back to some of the foundational texts of what is now known as queer of color analysis and critique. But this bridge called my back, the Combahee River Collective statement are two foundational, and I love how you're thinking and how you're using that in sort of your work in your teaching and sort of helping students deal with their sort of trauma and mourning. Ed, I really appreciate how you're sort of putting it to work in the context of Black queer counterpublics and posing some questions for us and thinking about sort of how that knowledge, whether or not, and how we might mobilize it in formal education, as well as trying to kind of keep sacred the way those spaces are important for healing and addressing sort of violence and stigma. And Roland, you also sort of gave us a really sort of another way of sort of putting queer of color analysis and critique to work in service of thinking through and responding to the violence that towards, in particular, sort of LGBTQ Asian Americans, but also using that as an invitation to think transnationally and in a way critique the way some of which queer of color analysis critique is being mobilized specific within particular sort of nation boundaries of particular sort of nation states. And I think that's really apropos to us in Canada, as we're always sort of thinking and sort of connecting across our state borders. So I want to open it up. We have some time. We have about 12 minutes for conversation. Either our panelists, if they want to sort of respond to something that's said, or we also have time if you have questions, please put those in the chat from our audience. We have about 10 minutes to discuss.
I'd love to have time for questions from the audience, since Roland, Cindy, and I, we can always chat with each other.
Absolutely, I concur.
In the meantime, as we're waiting to see if there are any questions, Cindy, do you have any thoughts across the different panels? Oops, you're muted again.
I loved each presentation, and I love the idea of the counterpublics because it crosses very nicely with this idea of infrapolitics in particular. And I always think about maybe some things shouldn't be written down in our research. You know, like some things shouldn't be unveiled. Like these really, like you said, sacred spaces, you know? And also, Roland, I totally appreciate you bringing up that language of grid and contamination and infection, that again and again, these tropes that are recycled, what, every 10 years now, every 15 years, that we've seen that. And so I'm kind of blown away by these logics that they don't go away. Maybe that's part of our project too, is to unpackage that, to see like why and how does this get. It's very stressful, I think, to be in the US at this time because of and I'm in Arizona, so we're like a red state turning purpley. And so it's very stressful to think that it might be close. I think it's going to be closer than we think for a president. And we're all dreading what might happen, what could happen. But I also don't want to talk about it in apocalyptic ways either.
You know, we have one question from the audience. Thanks, Cindy. I also, one of the, sort of the tensions that came out in the across the presentations is just the way in which we mobilize queer of color knowledge in sort of, or whether, when and how we do that, and how we do that sort of ethically, and how we do that to sort of both preserve and make sure that we're maintaining kind of support within queer of color communities, as well as using it as a way to sort of provide education, so outside of those communities. So sort of Ed raising questions about the counter publics and that knowledge production, and whether or not if that has a place in formal education, and Cindy raising, also providing an example of how very much you use this Bridge Called My Back and Combahee River Collective to help your students think through the current moment. So I think that's a tension that we have coming up. Would anyone like to say a bit more about sort of the queer of color framework? We have a question from Maggie about that, just to explain a little bit more about the queer of color framework. Could Cindy or
Might not
Roland?
get at the question directly, Lance,
Yeah.
but my thinking around pushing beyond the methodological nationalism of a lot of queer of color critique is in some ways going back to some of, and this is where Cindy's work in drawing from Anzaldúa and even folks like Audre Lorde have been so critical in thinking about queers of color from a very transnational lens. Because I think about the writings of both Lorde and Anzaldúa as always already transnational, always thinking beyond the kind of confines of the local or the nation state. So part of my interest in bringing up or reminding that there is a transnational dimension to queer of color critique is in many ways to remind ourselves in terms of that history or that genealogy, that for folks who are working on these kinds of intersections have always thought beyond the nation state.
Yes, Ed?
Lance, I just saw the question on, can we elaborate on queer of color critique? One of the things I tried to do in my presentation was show how specifically Black queer lived experiences are a source of producing knowledge about how power works, how Black queer communities navigate various spaces, adapting to how power shows up in those spaces. And for me, that kind of speaks to the broader field we're calling queer of color critique, queer of color analysis. That under this umbrella are populations that live at some very unique and fraught intersections. And those fraught intersections just become incredibly generative spaces to think about power, to think about identity, and to think about it in ways that often hasn't made it into other bodies of knowledge that have had, I don't want to say blinders, that have erected barriers to all of those intersections coming into play in knowledge production. But kind of clarify sort of where we're coming from with this broad umbrella of queer of color analysis, queer of color critique.
Ed, could maybe you could continue, and then sort of Roland and Cindy might also want to talk about their counter publics a bit more. There have been a couple of questions about why is it important to use the term counter public versus a term like just private, and also about pedagogies and sort of specifically about Black queer counter publics and pedagogy.
I can get started and try to be quick so that Cindy and Roland can chime in. So the notion of counter public, actually, I sort of I think it goes back to Nancy Fraser,
Mhm.
or at least she's one of the people who helped to make counterpublic something that got taken up in social cultural theory. But it's really about the counter is what distinguishes counterpublic from private. Private space doesn't necessarily entail or suggest resistance. Counterpublic is a construct that's saying this is a group, this is a collectivity that is organized around resistance against a hegemonic force, against dominance. And so that's why I said, and I said this really quickly, but that when I'm talking about Black queer counterpublics, I'm not simply talking about just, or when I'm talking about Black queer digital counterpublic, I'm not simply talking about Black queer people going online.
Right.
Black queer people can go online and, you know, send text to people and not be engaged in a kind of resistance, you know. So I think that's the real distinction, is that the counter is to counter forms of domination, and then to think about how that engages with pedagogy. You know, how can our pedagogical acts be driven by that desire to counter forms of power, forms of domination, which traditionally has been difficult in formal institutions, since formal institutions are created by states which are committed to domination. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thanks. Cindy?
I always think about the university as this place where you find those spaces to do, you call it counterpublics, but I want to think like with Maria Lugones when she talks about resistant socialities. And so she draws that out of Robin D.G. Kelly's work on the bus riders of Birmingham, Alabama, a 1992 article that he has. And it's really awesome because the article talks about, I guess, this priming of people in Birmingham, Alabama, riding the bus. The bus driver would never stop at their stop sign, the racist bus driver. So he would drop you off 2 miles away from your stop. And so everybody on the bus, all these Black riders, they would ring the bell, ring the bell, like to stop. And in some ways, Robin D.G. Kelly is kind of theorizing about these spaces where people learn to do this kind of collective resisting. I always use the gerund, right? Resisting. And so I wanted to think about these resistance spaces or these resistance socialities that I think that you're in them right now, where for me, queer youth of color learn to share knowledge outside of the surveillance of those in power. And so you learn new ways of being outside of that, because you're not defining yourself in terms of white supremacy. Now you've got your own space to dress your body the way that you want to dance, to enjoy life in an all Black space or an all queer of color space. And so here's these spaces that I think are really important for learning, like a new language, a new way to be, a new way to share knowledge. But also I'm really troubled because I think, is it for me to talk about these kinds of spaces too? You know, like, how do I talk about this in my own research? And so I always seem to collapse pedagogy with epistemology. And I don't know whether that's good or bad. I'll have to think about that later. But for me, you know, right now my pedagogy is Zoom online, you know, and I'm trying my best to be there for students, I don't have any answers for them, but I can listen, you know, and I can be there to witness in these ways what is happening around us, or the stress or the tension. Or I just had I had to talk to a student this week who had lost her grandfather and her mother within a few months. And she felt like she wasn't entitled to ask for, the university has extra money for COVID related expenses or for COVID things. And she didn't feel entitled to ask for that money. I'm like, girl, you're the one who made this money for. And I didn't talk her into that. And so it's been these little spaces that I think where pedagogically we're able to intervene or just be there with them. Because, you know, it is hard to connect on this line. And I don't really, I've really taken it, I haven't like internalized any like, oh, you're not showing your face on Zoom. I don't mind that, you know. People talk in my classes and they talk with me afterwards, and so I just try to be there for them, and then I try to be there for myself. When I say I'm trying to write differently, I am trying to write differently. I'm writing a memoir right now, and it's been hard to write and revise and to reconfigure my own experience so that I don't feel like growing up as like this queer in the corner, but that it was this matrix of all these things around me. And so it's been very freeing to write like that at this time.
Cool. Wow, so much to consider. Roland, I just want to give you an opportunity to, if you have, I know you spoke some about, I like Cindy sort of historicizing and also giving us another way into thinking about counterpublics through, what do you call it, resistant socialities. But Roland, do you, and then we're gonna take a bit of a break. Roland?
Yeah, I want to follow up in terms of this question about counterpublics, in some ways, how these counterpublics become pedagogical. I think of a space like Pride in Chinatown that recently took place in Vancouver. And these various Asian Canadian artists put together installations of the ways in which race, sexuality, class, place, diaspora really converge. I think this is a really important moment for us to really think about the importance of intersectionality when we're thinking about counterpublics. Because sometimes even some queers could take very homo-nationalist types of ways of doing resistance work that privilege some people over others. And within communities of color, there's also an ethno-nationalism in which some people get to be seen as spokespeople over others. An intersectional or interlocking approach to thinking about counterpublics become pedagogical in a sense that they bring together these kinds of analytics in very public or very counterpublic ways. So that Pride in Chinatown example in Vancouver recently provided us an opportunity to think about Chinatown as a space of possibility, as a space that's been very much hit violently and economically during the pandemic. It's a place that people have drawn away from. But what does it mean to come back to it, to revive, to reinvigorate, to change the dynamics? And simultaneously, what does it mean to queer up an ethnic racialized space, to provide the kind of sexual gender diversity that is constantly in existence within Chinatown? So something like that, whereas Ed focuses on the digital public, counterpublic, and I think that's really, really amazing. Here's also an opportunity to think about the counterpublic in its literal geospatiality in Chinatown. So that's one example in terms of Pride in Chinatown 2020 as a counterpublic that could still be done in person.
Woo! Okay. So much you've given us, all three of you. Thank you so much. We have to transition, but this is I hope our listeners and our audience, I didn't get to all of your questions. We are taking note of them, but we want to transition to the next panel. Thank you so much, Cindy and Roland and Ed, for opening up a whole bunch of questions and also giving us a whole bunch to think about. I really appreciate. And I appreciate the way you've sort of both theorized, and I also really talked concretely about pedagogy. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about being in education, is that we can sort of go across both of those. So thank you. And there will be more. I want to see if Dana Seitler, who is the director of the Sexual Diversity Studies program, would like to say a bit about that, and then we will transition to our next panel.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Lance. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Dana Seitler. I'm the director of the Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies at the University of Toronto. I want to begin by thanking Lance McCready and Tanitya Monroe and everyone at the Queer of Color Analysis and Education Research Institute for hosting this really incredibly vital conversation. I owe particular thanks to Navaz Makani and Emily Rivas for their tireless labor in helping to put this event together. Thank you so much for that. And of course, the greatest of thanks is to all the panelists sharing their words with us today. I was so riveted by and moved by the first panel. I'm looking forward to the second panel as well. The center's role in today's event is through our Committee on Schools and Education, of which Navaz and Emily are the co-chairs and Lance is a core member. The committee is a public education initiative of the Bonham Center. It's composed of university scholars from diverse institutions, as well as independent scholars, K through 12 educators, and professionals who work in schools and community-based organizations serving children, youth, and their families. The committee's major aim is to promote a better understanding of sexuality and education as they are written across race, gender, class, and religion. And the primary goal is to act and promote research into how sexual education is currently proceeding within the confines of existing institutional and social constraints, and to imagine alternative ways for doing that. So if you are in the GTA, we welcome new members on a rolling basis. So you just get in touch with the Bonham Center and we can set you up. We do very much welcome you to join us. So finally, I want to remind everyone that you have been sent an evaluation that we're asking you to fill out so we can gather important feedback about the event. And so as an incentive, we will select 4 completed evaluations at random, and they will be awarded a $25 Visa cash prize. So please fill them out. And thank you so much again to Lance and Navaz and Emily and the panelists, and everyone, please take good care.
Thanks so much, Dana. We really appreciate the report of the Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies, and I've loved working on the Committee for Schools and Education. I've been working on it for 10 years now, and it's been a journey, and it is always generative, very supportive, and a very vital space for my work. I want to now sort of introduce our second panel that is going to highlight how queer of color communities are forging new ways of thinking and enacting healing, resilience, resistance, and thriving in the midst of the COVID pandemic and the anti-Black racism related death. We began some of this conversation in our first panel, but we're going to flesh out even more of it in our second panel. First speaker will be Steve Mobley Jr. from University of Alabama. Our second speaker will be Vijay Kanagala from University of Salem State University. And our third speaker will be Kia Darling Hammond, who is the CEO, but also of her own consulting company, but also right now serving as the Education and Research Director of the National Black Justice Coalition. Okay, so Steve, thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It is really good to be here. I would also say that it is rather surreal, and I'll get into that in a second, because I never would have imagined myself on a panel like this in such amazing company. I remember when I met Ed when I was a master's student, and I was not nearly where I am now with regard to my own comfortability in my own skin. And even being able to, I remember when I first met Lance, I thought that I was like Janet Jackson. I was like, oh my gosh, like it's the Lance McCready. And I've just been using both of their work for a while. So when I'm thinking about resilience, resisting, and thriving, specifically with using queer of color critique or thinking about, you know, just queer students of color, just period, I think about the way in which this work can and should be used in a very radical way, right? So the way in which I would say I use it is to speak truth to power with regard to Blackness and also anti-Blackness within historically Black college and university contexts. So HBCUs were founded and born out of segregation and have been very, very much so important to Black communities, but they also always haven't been where they are now with regard to accepting diverse queer identities, right? And what does that mean? So when I'm thinking about even, you know, speaking truth to power, I think that it is, you know, just very important to acknowledge in a way, and to, let me see, I want to start my slideshow. Can you all see my screen? I'm trying to start the slideshow, but it doesn't.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. It's not letting me. Okay, start slideshow. All right, I'm scared my computer's gonna freeze. Well, these are 3 pictures, and they are of Bayard Rustin, Audre Lorde, and Lucy Digslow. So usually what I will ask people is, what do all 3 of them have in common? Besides being Black, of course, right? And you know, Bayard Rustin is a Black queer icon, so is Audre Lorde. Lucy Digslow, her queer identity is a bit, it's been erased. She is the first dean of women of any, first Black dean of women at any college, and she was at Howard University. She's also a founder of the oldest Black sorority in the country, Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, right? Her queer identity has oftentimes been erased, right? But when it comes to Bayard and Audre Lorde, we often don't know that these 2 individuals have HBCU ties, right? Bayard is a graduate of 2 HBCUs, and Audre Lorde was a poet in residence at TUGLU, right? How is it that Black bodies are not always able to exist as a total selves, right? Also, what I've found myself doing is looking back into the past and thinking of history in a way. I love this picture because I think that it connotes and denotes, again, how Black, queer, and trans communities have always been a part of HBCUs. If you look to the right in that picture, that is the legendary Octavia St. Laurent. And, you know, if you remember, if you all seen Paris is Burning, you know, one of her classic lines was, you know, was St. Laurent, of course, you know, acknowledging what house she was in. But there's a student there in a Morehouse t-shirt, right? Thinking about how this student may have been a Morehouse student, a traditionally all-male HBCU, but was obviously affiliated with ballroom culture, right? We often don't talk about these things. So when I'm thinking about resistance, all of these pictures as well, and, you know, anecdotes that I just shared do show how Black queer bodies have always been resilient and thrived within HBCU context. And I have made sure to infuse queer color critique within my work to talk back and amplify these voices. And what does it really mean in the, you know, present day? So one of the first things that I started thinking about when COVID did happen was, because students had to return home, is what's going to be happening, especially with our queer undergraduate students. And then my mind immediately went to what's going to happen with those who are present within HBCU context. And I have been really glad to see the ways in which these schools have stepped up. Many of the students who were allowed to remain on campus post-March and even throughout the summer were those queer and trans students at HBCUs who did not feel safe to, you know, go back home, and they used their agency to ask for this help. So they were present there, right? And I'm glad that these schools were able to step up in that manner, because these schools have served as sacred spaces and sanctuary for Black bodies, but not always Black, queer, and trans bodies, right? So for them to be able to have found safety in these environments during such a tumultuous time has been really, really great to see. Also, when I think of queer of color critique and being able to use this work and how do we use it now, and thinking about in the midst of and the aftermath of COVID, what does it mean to be in community and research, right? where can this research go? How are we going to be in community with the powers that be, the gatekeepers, to be able to do this research within HBCU environments? I'm thinking of a student who is doing some amazing work. I think he's actually one of the attendees, Jarrell Johnson at Iowa State University. I mean, I'm very excited about him because he is doing unapologetic, research on queer individuals at HBCUs, and even how are administrators, working with these students to make these environments better. But he's had to do data collection during COVID, right? I'm glad that he has been able to do that, but what does this research look like now when COVID isn't always, well, research is not always the priority, or letting people in with your schools? What does that really mean? So how can we even look further to use queer of color critique to enact community unapologetically with regard to speaking back to anti-Blackness and Black communities?
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Okay, Vijay.
Yes, give me 1 second. There you go. Trying to bring my slides. Do it this way. Okay, this is going to be interesting. Are you able to see my slides, all of them, or?
We can see.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to use it this way because I think I had the same issue earlier about not being able to read my notes. This is, again, my name is Vijay Kanagala. I use he, him pronouns, and I am an associate professor at Salem State University. And I know Lance was trying to say University of. I was at another institution before and I transitioned. So folks always know. I've just gotten used to saying where I'm at now. It's been about a year that I've moved to Salem State, which is in Salem, Mass. It is also the land of the Norm-Keg people. Before I get into queer options, I just want to acknowledge that this is an honor to engage with such a rich intellectual way of being and thinking and feeling about work that I'm just starting to get into. My work is centered around contemplative pedagogy and practices, which is kind of like the title of what I'm hoping this work will take me to. Thinking of queer options that Lance had mentioned earlier, the art and the ceremony of our pilgrimage, and just as a way to talk about the art and the art and ceremony of my own being coming into this work. Now I have to acknowledge that I identify as Desi South Asian queer. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I'm a family immigrant from India. And because of that, obviously, when we first came here to the country, obviously as immigrants, economic self-sufficiency was a big part of why we immigrated. But then you realize that there's something much more than that. And so the idea of settler colonizer comes into being. And what does it mean to grapple with that concept and that reality of displacing and living on somebody else's land as an occupier, right? And what does it mean to be in relationship to the Norm-Keg people, which is where I live now in Salem, Mass. And what does it mean to deal with all of this as a Desi queer immigrant with all of this? So like I mentioned, I engage with contemplative pedagogy and practice. And so if you will indulge me, I'm thinking of Houston Smith's work where he talks about the art of pilgrimage, right? And he says, the object of pilgrimage is not to rest in, is not rest and recreation to get away from it all, but it is to set out on a pilgrimage, is to throw down a challenge to everyday life. Nothing matters now but this adventure. So this evening, as I imagine my entry into this conversation, my queeruption as a Desi South Asian queer, and as a collective, our queeruptions as a with COVID happening, we would have been in person, but for COVID and our borders being closed, what does it all mean for us to be on this journey together? What does it mean to be on a pilgrimage to examine our trauma? What does it mean to be on a pilgrimage to heal as a community, as a global community, or even as nation states? And how are we dealing with such a multitude of interruptions, both as a society, but also as individuals, right? And specifically when we think about queer folks of color, how are we engaging the reality of what's happening around us? And what is the intersectionality of all of our being? And I think of a being as one unit, not the multitudes of who we are. And I often know, I have conversations with my mom often about this, and it feels like the universe, keeps flinging things at us nonstop. I often wonder, is she not weary of doing this to us, right? In terms of the multitude of issues that we've seen happen, if I can get political about it, since 2016, but of course, we can think of it in a much more longer timeline. So that's where my journey, of thinking about queeruptions begins, and I'm thinking about, Cindy Cruz had earlier mentioned about Gloria Anzaldua's work, and I'm drawn to Gloria Anzaldua's work partly because of my mentor Laura Rendon, in her work and her introduction to me to this work, but also thinking about Gloria Anzaldua's work in association with the 7 stages of conocimiento. She talks about, this is again from the Bridge Called My Back. You can find a chapter in that book, where she talks about the different stages that we have as people, as humans, that we engage with. And the first stage that she talks about is the El Arrebato, which is the loss of foundation, the shock that that we have to endure. So if I have to invoke our contemplative selves, our minds and our bodies and our spirits, our sensibilities of contemplative thinking and feeling, if we were to pause and investigate this moment that we're experiencing as a global community, whether it is with COVID or with anti-Blackness, and I think of both of these contexts, specifically within the United States. I often wonder what this would look like if my family had not immigrated, to the United States and we were still living in India. And that reality is something that I often think about. And again, what does it mean for queer folks of color? Thinking about COVID and anti-Blackness, and what would it mean for us to take a moment to pause? And I say that with a lot of privilege, right? And what does it mean to actually have the luxury of a moment? And is that even possible? I'm sitting here as an academic, but if I was not an academic, what would life be to engage with this? So I wanted to introduce this idea of the cajita. The art and when I think of the art in the ceremony, right? To me, this is cajita. A cajita is a small box, a sacred box, coming from Spanish, and it's a project that Alberto Pulido at the University of San Diego uses in his ethnic studies classes, and I've adopted it as part of my work within student affairs and higher education. And I have a collection of cajitas over the years that several students have engaged in, and this is mine. I thought I would know because we were doing this over Zoom. I thought I could share mine, but this is my cajita, and I call it my suitcase cajita. And when I when I think of my Kahita, it's a representation of all of the journeys that I've had to take, right from being in India to where I am today, identifying myself as a faculty of color, a queer faculty of color. And when I think of it in the context of engaging with the El Arrebato, and again, if we had more time, I would have asked all of us to engage in a little bit of an activity where, tell us moments of vulnerability and shock that each of us have experienced over these past few months. But just for lack of time, I'm going to, maybe perhaps list a few. For example, some of us may have lost a loved one, may have been diagnosed with a life-threatening disease, loss of job, loss of a relationship, whether we've left someone or somebody's left us. What about racism, sexism, homophobia, microaggressions and macroaggressions and things like that, right? And things go on. And in all of this, finding a sense of purpose and meaning has been really challenging. And so to me, when I think about, think about, anti-Blackness and COVID, I'm left with this question of what on-epistemic knowledge and wisdom do queer people of color educators draw upon to support our students of queer, QPOC students on our college campuses. And I say anti-Blackness, and I also am an agent of that anti-Blackness and acknowledge that. And so I am going to stop there, and we'll come back to a question and discussion afterwards.
Thanks so much, Vijay. Oh my gosh, you opened up a lot, but I think this is going to segue nicely into Kia's presentation. Thanks so much. Kia?
Okay, first, can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. Let's see if I can share my screen. Okay. So I want to frame what I'm going to get into with a theory of thriving that's born of the stories and experiences of Black, trans, queer, non-binary, and same-gender loving young adults, and has since been borne out by numerous conversations across identities and social positions. So this thriving framework is built on a number of the discourses on thriving and flourishing and well-being, but through a queer of color, an analytical and critical lens. It teaches us a lot to think about what thriving means in communities that are normally relegated to the margins. So for example, community is something everybody needs. We all know that belonging is critically important, but through that lens and through those discourses, we realize that there's an important place for social justice in the community frame or the community dimension of thriving, right? Not just being engaged in social justice as a mode of building community and finding belonging and affinity, but also the ways that that is a way of showing love to self and community, rather than in the more dominant theories, things like doing service, or giving back. This is more about creating a different world and true belonging and uncontested belonging. And so also in the selfhood dimension, which is not unfamiliar to people, identity is important, but resistant identity, an identity that is actually actively refusing the ways that society tells us that we can't be fully who we are and need to be, and a dimension that's actually very political around self-determination and the right to decide what happens to one's body and one's franchise, and the ways that those become fundamental to the thriving of people of color who are trans, non-binary, same-gender loving, and queer. Abundance, there's often discourse on resilience in this literature rather than what actually I think people are aiming toward and casting toward, which is abundance. So abundance is about being able to have enough hope and cognitive and emotional space to dream. It's about having aspirations. And of course, it's about having the resources that you need to thrive. And so for example, one of the young people I interviewed at the very beginning of the study talked about the joy that she had living in Oakland, California, which meant that she had access to a yoga studio that catered to and had practitioners in it who were queer people of color. And it meant that she was in a space where she felt like she could simply relax into the work of being well and of healing, rather than worrying about other social dimensions that would have made it feel hostile to her. Pleasure is the sort of the fourth of 6 dimensions. And of course, we know we all need laughter and joy and passion and purpose. I'm going to talk a little bit about K-12 schooling. And one thing to note is that purpose is actually a really important dimension of the developmental landscape for young people. It's important for all people, but it's especially important for young people, as it does some really important protective work for the psyche. And we're so concerned about mental health right now. Paying attention to purpose really matters in that framework. And the other piece that I think is really important is what medicine teaches us, which is that in the face of toxic stressors, which I'll mention again later, things like being able to be in community, having a strong integrated sense of identity, having ample resources for thriving, and of course, being able to be joyful, actually do physical healing work. They do mental and emotional healing work. And so pleasure is really, really important. And then finally, there's relief. Relief is about safety. This is so important. It's about freedom. And as I said before, it's about healing. So I just have a few thoughts at the intersection of schooling and the quest for thriving. And I'm going to throw that slide back up so people can kind of refer to it as I speak. So I'll just begin with Uncle Jimmy. James Baldwin wrote about a lie that was born of slavers and colonizers' need to create a hierarchy of lives and bodies that excuse the horrors of chattel slavery or massacre, and has become embedded in today's beliefs about whose lives are worthy of protection and whose are not. Uncle Jimmy is also quoted as saying, "The purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers." And in this case, art is queer of color analysis and critique. And when we put Black and Indigenous and Asian and Latinx, trans, queer, non-binary, gender expansive, sexuality expansive people at the center, we see the lie that Uncle Jimmy was talking about, and we see the institutions that uphold it more clearly. One of the things that the lie obscures is this truth, which is that as long as there have been people, there have been trans, queer, non-binary, same gender loving, and other sexuality and gender expansive people of color. Period, always. And when we apply this lens, this queer of color analytical and critical lens, then we excavate and amplify the stories of people like Gladys Bentley and Ernestine Eckstein and Sylvia Rivera and Miss Major Griffin Gracie and Jose Sarria out of San Francisco. And we look for the other people who still need to be discovered and talked about. Through a queer of color analytical and critical lens, we see that music and community and art and dancing are central to healing and self-discovery and belonging. And through that lens, we see that accessible, stable housing and healthcare literally saves lives. We've always been here. We've made contributions to every facet of human culture and development. And really importantly, whether people realize it or not, whether we're visible to them or not, young people of color who are gender and sexuality expansive are doing the critical work of becoming in physical and virtual classrooms all over the world. And because we live in raced bodies, because our identities have been deemed other and disposable, we're overrepresented among unhoused youth. Almost half of the unhoused youth in the United States are LGBTQ+, and among unhoused adults, among the incarcerated, among the disenfranchised, among the underemployed, and among the prematurely dead, whether that's from police brutality and the carceral state more generally, or from the toxic stresses of discrimination and resource precarity, or from a global pandemic. So I'm going to make an explicit connection to learning and schooling. In 2019, GLSEN's National School Climate Survey found that roughly half of LGBTQ+ and same gender loving youth heard homophobic remarks, and 2 out of 3 heard negative remarks about gender expression from their teachers or other school staff. The Trevor Project found that almost half of Black same-gender loving youth have seriously considered suicide in the past year. And that number rises to more than half among Black, trans, and non-binary youth have seriously considered suicide. More than 1 out of 3 trans, queer, non-binary, and same-gender loving youth, have experienced homelessness. It's 1 out of 3, been kicked out or run away. So in the space of schooling are young people who are grappling with all of this. The context of learning, as many of you know, begins with relationships. Learning is social. So one of the things that we have to think about is whether or not there's trust, mutuality, respect, and safety, community. It's right there. It also has to do with the state of the body. Am I hydrated? Am I fed? Am I experiencing nutrient density in my food? Am I well rested? Can I be mobile when I need to be? Am I oxygenated? Is my brain oxygenated? Am I allergic? And then in schools, you get into questions like, can the child pee when they need to? Or do they have time and freedom to hygienically change a tampon if they need to? And then you get into the question of the state of the heart. Is it happy? Is it sorrowful? Is it anxious? Is it shamed? Is it fearful? Is there safety? Right now we're grappling with the sort of social culture and climate that affects the school culture and climate, and the classroom culture and climate, and the household culture and climate. And that's including for young people who are at the intersections of being raced and having gender and sexuality expansive identities, things like the atmospheric, you never know where it's going to come from, but the persistent threat of death, whether that's due to your perceived race or ethnicity or citizenship, your gender expression, your sexuality. And this sense of threat and risk increases as your family income decreases. So all of these things become combined. We have a fascistic federal administration with a fascistic base that's increasingly emboldened and violent. And we're in a pandemic. For young people whose identities are gender and or sexuality expansive, if they have a home, being at home may be creating a situation where they're hiding. It may be creating a situation where there's actual physical hardship or violence. People have lost, of course, the opportunity to interact with peers at school sites. There's isolation in a different way. For anybody whose household stability requires being on the front lines, of course, there's an increased risk of illness and death. And of course, as everyone has talked about today, there's that sense of mourning. I think the other thing that's really important in the space of sort of the K-12 schooling is that because people have switched to online learning, young people have been letting teachers and others into their homes through this sort of meeting technology, which has resulted in increased and very personal surveillance and punishment, including children being suspended or threatened to be suspended, one child being incarcerated, another child, more than one child having the police called on them because of something a teacher saw or thought they saw. And so these sort of culture of compulsion and compliance and control is very present now, instead of a culture of empathy and learning, which is really what young people need. So this is the context for learning right now. And thriving reminds us to look at community, selfhood, abundance, pleasure, and relief, and the ability to simply be. That piece in the middle, that sixth dimension, is when those things come together, people report being able to actually simply be, to just exist. And it's interesting because some of that has happened in the wake of the pandemic. The increased emphasis on access to broadband and computers has allowed more people in some cases to get online, and has allowed some young people to find community that they couldn't find locally online. So there's something that educators can do to make sure that there's an awareness of the kinds of media that might affirm a multitude of identities and experiences in the online space, especially if it's not available in the physical space. Children have for many, many months had a respite from the threat of being shot at school. I don't know if people remember this, but we were having a huge problem with school shootings before this pandemic hit. And young people have reported feeling relieved because they're not being inundated by insults and slights and threats in hallways and restrooms and other spaces. And also I've talked about not feeling as much anxiety because they're not dealing with the adults in their schools, overt and covert sort of judgment, disapproval, and sometimes, as the statistics tells us, outright abuse. So when asked about experiences of thriving, young people and older people tend to locate it outside of school. So this is sort of an invitation for us as educators to think about what it would mean to create this kind of an environment instead inside of schools. And while there are some ways that schools can make a contribution, so for example, being on a college campus gives young people some autonomy to explore their identity, their sexuality, their capacity for freedom more fully. Or sometimes on college campuses, there's coursework that's more identity affirming or gives them a sense of political agency that was lacking in their pre-college work. But of course, not everybody goes to college and not everybody has access to that safety net. So anyway, when we look at what we're taught formally and explicitly in K-12 settings and what we need to know as an adult, it's interesting to think about how things line up through this lens of thriving. So for example, did you, when you were in K-12, learn how to navigate health insurance and healthcare? Did you learn about the importance of the federal judiciary, right, beyond the Supreme Court? Or what about this? Did you learn how to set healthy boundaries? In a queer of color analytical frame, you can look at chosen family and you can look at Friendsgiving as examples of ways that people have established healthy boundaries around their well-being. Have you seen in K-12 learning how to make sure that your needs are met in an unequal power relationship? Well, through a queer of color analytical lens, look at shade, look at reading, and look at the modes of refusal that exist in communities. And what about dreaming and building a better world? You can look at the practices in the house and ballroom community that are all about imagining, dreaming, building, mutual support, and so on. And so from the margins, Black, Asian, Indigenous, and Latinx gender and sexuality expansive folks have been doing this, thriving, imagining, dreaming, creating, and really can offer guidance to the rest of us. So fundamentally, the bridge to thriving.
Hi, Kia. Just
Oh,
short.
sorry. Am I out of time? This is my
Yes,
last
I'm sorry
slide.
you could. Okay, last slide. Okay, great.
It is, sorry, cut it. So where we are right now is unfortunately in the space of too much insufficiency. The bridge to thriving includes all of these things I've talked about. And ideally, I'm hoping that we will work to build more contexts within which people can simply be. And that is it.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. More to think about. I really want to thank our panelists. We're now going to open up to sort of Q&A. We are going to go over until approximately 7:15, so I hope you all can sort of stay and join us. Just a bit about the words of Steve, Vijay, and Kia. I just really appreciate Steve really starting us off thinking about how queer of color communities are forging new ways of thinking and enacting healing, resilience, and resistance and thriving by really focusing on an institution that many people see as the site of a lot of violence, and that's historically Black colleges and universities. And I think you've reminded us and you've given us some wonderful examples of how queer people of color and Black queer bodies specifically have thrived in HBCUs and continue to thrive, and that it's really important how we support scholars who are excavating that sort of those experiences and doing that work, and really how we might look to HBCUs and some of the ways students have been able to heal in the context of those institutions, even through COVID. And even through some of these experiences of anti-Black racism. And I really appreciate also the way Vijay is bringing in new ways of thinking about and thinking through pedagogy and queer of color analysis and critique, and sort of introduced us to contemplative practice and the role of art in ceremony, in healing, and some of the ways that you're doing that sort of in sort of your own life, how you're sort of putting that into practice, putting it to work really in your classroom, and also asking some questions of how we might also think even more expansively of that and using art and ceremony to heal through a queer of color lens. And then finally, we've always had one person that has asked Kia, like, where can they find your sort of framework for thriving? I really think you've done one of the most important things in queer of color critique and analysis, which is really put the bodies and epistemologies at the center of thinking about sort of thriving queer of color sort of bodies. And that is so important. And the young people, and really, I also appreciate the way you're trying to shift the conversation away from resilience and to thriving, away from resilience to abundance. I think those are really important shifts, and you've given us several examples and ways of thinking about that. And the idea of creating space to just be and exist. And I think that's a huge challenge that you've posed for schools, but I've also think that you've given us a way of thinking about it so that it becomes even more of a possibility. So I want to thank all three of our speakers on the panel too. Opening up now for questions. We're going to go until 7:15. I don't know if you have things that you want to comment on or ask each other, Vijay, Steve, and Kia. And then I'll get to some ones in the chat.
I was just going to say I loved the presentations, and Steve, I need to check in with you about a student I'd like to connect you with on the HBCU stuff, who's doing similar work.
Let's see, there's some question here. I'm wondering also, you know, also about how queer of color analysis and critique takes up the manipulation, how the fact that these histories, I think Steve, Vijay, and Kia, you know, also bringing the work of James Baldwin to bear, and sort of saying that as a foundational scholar, thinker, artist, writer in queer of color critique. You know, how are you using it to address the way the current moment there's so much manipulation of our histories? You know, what do you think, what impact might this have on the pedagogy and education in formal and non-formal sites of learning? I think that's one question.
To say something about that if it's...
Yeah.
Okay, so one critical dimension of healing and a revolution is telling the truth. And a piece of telling the truth is part of what queer of color analysis and critique invite us to do, which is to be in a constant state of excavation. We have to do a lot of work to seek out and to preserve and to amplify the stories that otherwise tend to be buried or erased or censored under a fascistic kind of regime. And that preservation is important. I think that in formal educational context, there tends to be a bias towards safety and not upsetting the apple cart and not, you know, losing funding and all of these things. And so there's a piece of the work that happens outside of the formal context that's about building relationship, mutuality, and being in discourse and conversation that, again, tells the truth. And then there's a part of it that's about being brave to the extent that you can be brave, using what cover you might have in institutional spaces to make sure that these conversations are happening about what's real, about what's true, about what change looks like, and about, of course, what has come before that may be being obscured right now. It's not safe. And I think that there's a myth of safety that we have to really think and talk about. But there's always the possibility of greater unsafety. And different people are positioned in different levels of distance from what might be safer. And so it's also an opportunity to think about how people can leverage what privilege they do have to create the context for continued questioning, growth, excavation, amplification, and change.
Thank you, Vijay. And
I was going to add to the point of excavation. It's always it's always interesting. I mean, we just had National Coming Out Day, and one of the things that I've had conversations around just the idea of coming out, right? And thinking about queer folk, who is able to come out, and in what communities are you able to do that, and especially when you think about COVID, where it's so it's unsafe in a health-wise way of thinking and being, but also because of where people are and what communities you live in, are you able to come out, right? And that's a huge thing. And I speak positionality of being a Desi South Asian, in whether with COVID or without COVID, that is a very different process, right? And when we talk about excavation, and thinking about and when I have to use my own idea of a pilgrimage, what points are those joyful, and what points are they traumatic excavations? How do we actually who has the luxury to do that too, right? And I think Kia brings up that beautiful point of being able to thrive in all of this, and at what point can we say that that it's still an ongoing process? It'll always be an ongoing process, right?
Thanks.
No,
Steve, I also want to just say before you begin that there is a question specifically about wanting to know more about your thoughts around employing queer of color critique and analysis to resist the erasure of Black queer identities in HBCUs, and to know what your thoughts are on applying queer of color analysis and critique to illuminate Black queer resilience in the midst of trauma and erasure.
Oh, I love those questions. So I think that part of it, I was actually going to speak a bit to this, is I think there's power in naming. So we're thinking about excavation and what does that look like? I wrote a book chapter where I did feature Bayard and Audrey and Lucy Diggs Slow. And there's always a politic around that because I literally was in Slow's archives, right? And there is something that I wrestle with, and I talk to a lot of friends about this, is what does it mean to maybe quote unquote out somebody in death, right? Or deliberately name that, because we don't know if she possibly would have used those words, but we know that she had a longtime partner who took over her estate when she died, or things like that, right? So what does that power of naming really look like when you're doing a queer color critique, or when you're trying to talk back? Because the history is political. I think about the power of this name, maybe my own alma mater, for instance. Myself and a mentee, Trinice McNally, who is actually the director of the LGBT Center at UDC, which is another HBCU in DC. She talks about how we could literally start giving Black, queer, and trans college tours, right? At Black colleges, right? So what does it mean to walk the hollow grounds of different universities and have these things that are hiding in plain sight? There's a whole Elaine Locke Hall at Howard, right? The father of the Harlem Renaissance. And he was, queer. You have all of these, prominent, even looking at some of our current people, I think about the new phenomenon that is, the Pose series, right? The actress who plays Electra is an HBCU alum, right? I would love to speak with her about her experiences. What was that like, right? So I think that in doing this work and having the power in naming is key. I think about even illuminating what these students are going through, queer and trans HBCU students. I remember a mentee of mine who actually just wrote an article with that's coming out where we talk about the Black, queer, and trans student activism at HBCUs that's happened very recently and changes that have been made. He said, Dr. Mobley, one thing that I want you to, that I need to tell you, they were a student at Morehouse. They've since graduated. They said, you know, we are not victims, right? And we have to work to actively transgress and resist this Black tragically queer narrative that pervades the literature, right? And that forever shifted my thinking, because I do think of those students who are doing things in spite of, or who may be out, or who may be queer questioning, but they're still able to have some semblance of joy at these schools, because these Black, queer, and trans students choose HBCUs for a reason. They want to be around their people. My question to HBCUs always is, how do you do that with, if these students are coming to you, you need to be able to serve them, and they shouldn't be encountering this anti-Blackness that can, you know, peak out in the form of homophobia or transphobia. So I always turn the question back on. These students are here and they're doing great things. They're in your SGA. They are running your campus. They're very highly involved student leaders, and maybe being in your homecoming court, right? They pledge these fraternities and sororities. Talk directly to them and ask them what they need, right? And how does that really look?
Thank you so much. I think that's always one of the important things, and the tensions that we don't have time to engage with today as much, but to what extent as educators are we really engaging with sort of queer of color bodies, queer of color epistemologies, queer of color students? It's sort of a theme that runs through my work as well, is that sometimes we're really not. There's a lot of separation and division and divide. So one of the questions, I think that maybe this is good to bring this to a close, is there was a question about how, what are the resources that you're used to think about thriving art and ceremony in the context of schools? Do you have any suggestions for sort of resources for educators here, either working in sort of higher education or K-12 schools?
The question about resources is a really good one. I would say the first thing to do is to think about relationships, right? All learning, most learning is social, and think about the community that's being created, and think about the gender norms and norms about, you know, sort of sexuality and ways of being that might be at play in your culture. And so anything that helps you to dismantle, I can send specifics later, but anything that helps you to dismantle normative ideas about sexuality and gender will be important. And anything that's about building strong, trusting, mutual kind of community space that privileges and empowers young people as experts in their experience, and privileges or creates the conditions for empowerment for them to engage in the work of solving problems that are relevant to their daily lived experiences, is the place to begin. I'd say more another time when there's time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Vijay?
In terms of, when you think about resources, right? Is that what you're asking?
That was one of the questions, yes.
I mean, I'm not, for me, it's mostly, you know, coming from a space of higher education and student affairs. And so one, I think about practice and practitioner-based ways of engaging, right? That's one way I think about it. I can't specifically think of anything right now top of my head, other than, of course, our queer options could be our, you know, journal article. It could be one of them, because that one specifically speaks to college students and how queer practitioners of color could be supporting students on college campuses. I obviously I'm not well versed with K through 12 as much as I probably should. But yeah.
Thank you. I think I didn't sort of make that clear in the introduction, but many of our panels today were authors in a special issue of Equity and Excellence in Education, recently published on queer eruptions and using queer of color analysis and critique to sort of disrupt, again, dominant discourses in education. So please check that out. Vijay and his colleague Stephen Oliver have a wonderful article in there. Kia, sort of, that's one of the places where you could get read about Kia's framework for thriving. And there are a number of other sort of excellent articles in there. So thanks. And finally, Steve, any concluding remarks or?
Yes, so we're thinking about resources or people that are specifically wanting to engage in HBCU work, or if there's anybody out there that's wanting to do that. I recently had an article published with an amazing PhD student at Howard, who is also the director of the Human Rights Campaign's HBCU initiative. And we actually, together, we conceived a model of practice for how HBCUs can better retain their queer and trans students and what that even looks like. And if you think about it, it starts at admissions and recruitment, and it ends at graduation, but we talk about how to engage alumni and wrap it back around in recruitment and mentoring of students on there. So we talk about the academic experiences, the social experiences, and just give some very candid recommendations about how to better engage these students.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but again, I was really impressed with this second panel, how deeply you are theorizing and contemplating and expanding queer of color analysis critique, and then also how you're also attempting to really think of concrete ways of bringing that into your practice. And again, I feel like that's one of the privileges and wonderful things about working in education, how we can be both really go deep theoretically and epistemologically, as well as then think really concretely about pedagogies. So thank you so much. This sort of brings to a close the Queer of Color Analysis Education and Research Institute virtual one that focuses on redefining and reimagining education in times of COVID and anti-Blackness. I want to thank our panelists, Professors Cindy Cruz at Brockenbrough, Roland Coloma, Steve Mobley Jr., Vijay Kanagala, and Kia Darling Hammond.